Hello, everyone. It's Damon with MBTV. Very special show today. We're talking about the Keirsey Temperaments, and we have special guest Ben Vaserlan and his channel, which I've referred to in a previous live show. And again, I actually forgot to put that link in the description, but I added it now, so you guys can go back and get that link to his channel. He covers all aspects of temperament and personality. I also have a very special guest, Jeff here, who is a Keirsey specialist and enthusiast and defender, apologist for Keirsey, as far as I understand. And he'll be helping us understand further the Keirsey temperament, putting up an argument for it and some of the common arguments against it. And we all also have co-host Daniel and co-host Trey here as well. So without further ado, we got Jeff, who's going to explain the Keirsey temperament and kind of the differences in what it is. So let's start off with what got you into Keirsey and why do you support it so much?
Okay, first of all, I have a channel too, and it's the SP Spaz, so if anybody wants to check that out. But I think actually I was about 19 or 20, and my mother got the book Please Understand Me by David Keirsey, and I have two brothers, and she wanted to give us all the test that was in it, which is called the Keirsey Temperament Sorter. And it's sort of based on the MBTI, though a little bit different. And so she gave us all the tests. And of course, at the time, I didn't really put any stock in it. I just thought this is kind of silly. This is something that, thinks it can like put us in groups based on these questions or whatever. And not only did I not take it seriously, but I actually tried to mess with it because my mother made the mistake of telling me that she had types that she thought we all probably were from reading the book. So I decided, well, I'm gonna mess with I'm not gonna answer truthfully because I don't want to end up her being right. So I kind of screwed with it. And anyway, that was the first I heard of it. And after that, I read some of the book, but I didn't really think about it much for a while after that. Online, it would occasionally, somebody would post a link to a personality test or something. So I would see that and, sometimes do it or whatever. And so I sort of vaguely remembered that when I did one of those, I don't know, maybe 03, 04 or something like that, that I had come up as ISFP on the test. And so I remembered that, but I didn't really care about it that much. And then in 2008, I don't really know what prompted me, but for some reason another one of those popped up, and instead of just sort of dismissing it like I usually did, I actually searched for information about, whether there was forums about it or anything to discuss the types and things like that. And I came across a site that was called MBTI Central then, and later changed to Typology Central. And so I actually started participating in that. And part of the reason, and if you know anything about, SPs as a temperament, that one thing, we do is to kind of sink ourselves into one thing, one action or whatever, and just get really wrapped up in that and kind of do that all the time. And so that particular time, I was sort of getting out of whatever it is, the last thing I was doing. And that sort of was the next thing that I sunk myself into for some reason, which was weird because I would have never thought I would got into anything that was psychology based or anything like that. But for some reason I did. So I was into it for a while. And I think it was somebody on that forum actually that recommended the book, Please Understand Me Too, the sequel to the original book. The second one came out in '98. So I actually ordered that book and I read it, and I was really impressed. I was actually kind of surprised with how accurate it was when I read the chapter on the Artisan or SP temperament. I was like, this is almost eerie how much it seems to know about my motivations for things and stuff. And that was hard for me to admit because, like I said, I didn't want to. I've always been very individualist, so I always have this kind of attitude of, people can't be so easily put in categories and all that. People are do their own thing and unique and all that. So it was weird for me to have something that was describing so well the way I operated, and I at first didn't really want to admit it was true. But as the more I read it and thought about it, I said, this really in a lot of ways describes me. And part of it was my age too. I mean, by that time I was in my 30s, so I was like a little bit more mature and accepting, of things, not being quite as, stubborn about accepting stuff like that. So, yeah, I mean, my interest in it has kind of waxed and waned, but the thing about it is that once I was aware of the temperaments and saw them in real life, saw, the things from the book about like the words people use and even hand gestures and things like that, and what's important to different temperaments, like what motivates them and what things they sort of respond to. In real life, I would see these things play out so much that I would recognize them, where even when I wasn't really that interested in the topic anymore, I kind of moved on to doing other things, I would still see the evidence of it just in my daily life. It would keep popping up. I would see people that would say things or do things that, would clue me into those elements of the temperament. So, it's something that, and at one point I actually said with my son, I said, I hope I don't entirely forget this, because knowing what I do about him, like he might help him in school or, talking to his teachers or things like that. So I remember thinking that I didn't want to completely forget the concept, so that if it came up, I, could talk about it a little bit. And it's been just one of those things that I'm aware of, but I wouldn't call myself a specialist or anything like that. I would just say that to me, of all the personality type systems that I've seen, for me personally, the Keirsey system makes the most sense because it covers the basics of human action. That is, the words people use and the tools people use, like their words and actions is basically what people do. And it's a lot easier to kind of observe that in real life with people than it is things like cognitive functions, where, there's so much speculation as to what might be going on in someone's head. Whereas you can see what people do and say. And I've always looked at it as, I don't tell people, don't use system A or system B for whatever you want to do, because I'm like, whatever works for you is the way I look at it. But to me, I feel like what's most effective or useful to me is what I see actually, playing out in real life. So that's the way I look at it.
Well, Jeff, I have a few questions regarding that. First, I'd like our audience to understand that if I'm correct, and you can always correct me, I'm not a specialist on the Keirsey system, but let me ask you, is it, it's obviously the way you've stated, it's a little more behavior based. You can look at things and observe the words and tools. Now, he talks about a transition from one role to another role. Are those words and tools changed when a person takes another position or fills another role? Or do they stick with the original temperament tools they use naturally and try to fill that role with those tools and words?
Well, I think that, a follow-up book to Please Understand Me Too, the one called Brains and Careers. And what I really liked about that book is he talked about, because I think there was a little bit maybe, what's the word I'm looking for, misunderstanding or sort of a feeling that he was saying that, if I, for instance, I call, this person type the counselor, well, I'm saying that that's got to be the profession they go into or something like that. And that book's talked a lot about how anybody can do, can play any role, can pursue any profession or whatever, but there are people that are naturally suited to certain roles over others. And so if your natural role is a counselor, but your job is, say, an accounting job or something like that, you're going to not be as naturally suited to that job. It doesn't mean you can't do it, but it means you might have to work harder because you're sort of working against your own instincts in terms of what you're really good at. So I would say, as far as the words and tools part, everybody can learn to use the words and tools of other roles, but there's always going to be something that comes more naturally to them. So I mean, he covered on a basic level the words being everyone prefers concrete or abstract. And it doesn't mean that people don't use both, because pretty much everybody does, but they're always going to be a preference, one way or the other. And the funny thing is, that's another thing you can kind of see play out, is that you can observe a conversation and see that the people who prefer concrete words are always sort of trying to steer the conversation back to real life examples of things, whereas the people who prefer abstract bring it back to concepts and what if questions and, you know, sort of the stuff behind the concrete. So, you know, you see that those preferences play out as people just have normal conversations.
Yeah, and so we have each category of temperament here. So we have the, you know, NT, NF, SP, and SJ in this particular chat. I'm curious to know, you know, we talk about these role transitions. My particular question is that when we move from, say, anything in the strategy concept, so moving from NT to another type of NT, in the sense we're to parallel this with Myers-Briggs, for example, you know, initiating mobilizer myself, is it easier to move to any other strategy role than it is to move into another temperament, such as diplomacy or tactics or whatever comes next, or is it harder to move down in the, say, this different strategy role, such as a designer or modeler?
I mean, I would think that overall it would be easier, yeah. But I think when it comes to what plays out in, you know, daily life, there's a lot of other factors to play into that, like, you know, who you grow up around, your background, things like that. So there's sort of the age-old debate of, you know, nature versus nurture thing, like how much is ingrained in people and how much comes from their environment that they grow up in and what they learn. So, you know, I can't obviously put like a number on any of that, but I would say in general, it's probably overall easier, yeah, to move to a different strategic role than it is to switch to one of those other things. But, you know, that's sort of all things being equal. If someone grows up in an environment where they're surrounded by idealist temperament people, then they might be a little bit more naturally able to move in that direction than somebody who hadn't, you know, just as an example.
Yeah, that was my natural assumption. I figured it'd be easier for somebody who prefers strategy overall to stay in the strategy category than it is to move into, say, diplomacy or tactics or that particular category. But, you know, and it obviously is totally separate. Another question I want to ask you in specific is when we talk about the MBTI, would somebody's MBTI type directly translate to the Keirsey system, or could it be potentially different? In your opinion?
That's something that's been discussed quite a bit, and I think you know what Keirsey himself said is he definitely thought there were strong correlations, which is why in the, you know, first two books that he wrote, he used the Myers-Briggs letters and basically, you know, interchangeably with his roles. And the reason he moved away from that was not as much that he felt like that those didn't correlate anymore, but just that he was getting kind of flack from Myers-Briggs people that you know, he was using their terms but his system was different. So it was more of a kind of a reaction to that than it was him deciding that, you know, these didn't correlate with each other. So he basically still maintained that, you know, that they pretty much were interchangeable with Myers-Briggs types. And the reason, and he originally, you know, studied Myers-Briggs and, you know, MBTI himself and learned these things. And it was only like he sort of had learned all this other stuff about four temperament theory, you know, going way back to like, you know, Plato and stuff like that, and many other authors over the years and psychologists had you know, looked at this four temperament thing, and basically he sort of saw the correlations himself and mapped them together and said this makes sense as far as, you know, with the Myers-Briggs letters you can sort of form these temperaments. But the one, you know, sort of inconsistency he saw was that Isabel Myers had grouped NTs, NFs, and then STs and SFs. And as Keirsey looked at the, you know, what sort of groups of people fit best together, he said that actually with the S types that they split differently, that SJs had more in common with each other, or STs and SPs had more in common with each other that way. So that grouping worked better for him.
Yeah, and I always go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, David Mark Keirsey is a computer scientist. He's the son of David West Keirsey. He said in an interview with NF Geeks that originally the original Myers-Briggs descriptions were like 1 or 2 sentences, it was like a tiny paragraph for each type. And he said that his father was the one that actually wrote the full profiles. So maybe the MBTI profiles most of them were written by Keirsey all along. What do you think of that, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what's ended up on websites, it's funny what ends up being attributed to who, because you have a lot of things where people will talk about Jungian types, but then they have a bunch of information there that was not anything Jung ever said. They were things that other people, came up with, but then they credited Jung as being sort of the origin of some of those concepts. And the same thing is true with a lot of Myers-Briggs stuff. There's a whole lot of stuff that Keirsey, came up with, or sort of, worked on and mapped himself, that sort of gets put as, labeled MBTI because it's all kind of lumped in the same group. So yeah, I mean, my feeling is that the only problem with putting them together is where you have people sort of confusing the elements of it, and that's why I sort of specified why I preferred Keirsey's system, is because as soon as you start using MBTI letters, there are people that assume that they assume all this other stuff about Jungian functions, which doesn't necessarily add up. I don't have a problem using MBTI letters interchangeably with the Keirsey temperaments, because to me, the MBTI letters themselves only tell you 4 preferences. They don't really tell you all these other things that some people like to speculate. But when you do that, you have some people that get confused. So, it's, to me, it's sort of a shorthand, easy way to remember. That's why when I did my channel, I based it on NF Geeks, and I made my channel the SP Spaz, because I figured the SP was, most people will remember the letters, and more so than they remember necessarily Artisan, Idealist, things like that. Not everybody. Like my younger brother, for instance, said he can remember the temperament names better than he mixes up the letters. So it depends on the person. Some people remember one thing better than others. But to me, I see enough correlation between them that I don't have a problem, using those in conjunction with each other. But I don't have any problem. If somebody says to me, well, you shouldn't use Myers-Briggs letters because it's not exactly the same, I see their point, because I don't like to confuse people. I think the most important thing, the whole reason for all of it, in my opinion, is understanding. And so it should be sort of the aim is to use terms that the most people understand. So that's what I try to do.
Go ahead.
Chad, yes. What happened was, and Junior said in the NF Geeks interview that his father studied the model by Ernst Kretschmer in this book, Physique and Character, and this was a book written in the mid 1920s. Ernst Kretschmer was sort of like the head of psychology in Germany. And then it was Carl Jung took over. When Hitler came to power, Ernst Kretschmer resigned. So the reason I say that is that Kretschmer's book, Physique and Character, he looked at people's body type and their temperament, and he said that only when people he said that among psychiatric patients, there was a relationship between, say, if someone was, say, we call it a schizotype, and whether they had certain, because it's people got these weird conditions because of glandular problems and hormones. And when you look at this, when you look at his list of schizotype traits and psychotype traits, it's sensing and intuiting. And basically, so he studied this model, Keirsey Senior, and then when he saw, as Jeff said, ST and SF, he says, no, it makes more sense to do it as SJ and SP. So he did. So because Keirsey Senior was a INTP, they do that thing called transcontextual thinking, and he said, I know, if we use this and this and combine it. And so we brought it across from Ernst Kretschmer. And as Jeff said before, these Kretschmer temperaments, they go back throughout history, loads of previous systems. And Chad, it's mentioned in the personology book, these 4 types that throughout history that are mentioned.
The one thing I definitely can say for the Keirsey system, it is like Socionics. It's very in-depth and it's startlingly accurate, at least as far as I've read in each temperament. I've cross-referenced it with people the same, similar to the same MBTI type or as close as we can get. And they're like, yeah, wow, that sounds like a very strong description of me, and I've cross-referenced with that. In my experience, it's very, very accurate. it does take a lot, because Keirsey obviously did a lot of research on the particular system that he went in. I mean, if you read the beginning of most of his books, like, hey, here's everyone I've referenced from, 700 BC going forward, and different models and different all these things. And he just goes through all these different things to get to this point of where it is today, the temperament system. But that's going to transition me into my next question for Jeff, which is, Jeff, what are the common arguments against Keirsey that you've heard, and why are those arguments wrong?
Well, I mean, again, normally, like anybody that I talk to, like in daily life, that I sort of bring up the concept with, or present the information, they respond well to it and saying, "Oh yeah, that makes sense," or "I know people that that seem to fit this," or "It sounds like me." A lot of different people from different sort of walks of life have responded well to it. The hostility towards it is usually, I've found, only in online communities that are devoted to a particular other way of looking at things. So you have people that I call the young theists, which are sort of the people that are devoted to Carl Jung and trying. Usually, the funny thing is that a lot of the times they don't really stick to things Carl Jung actually said, but they try to take things from his psychological types and sort of mutate it into their own kind of abstract system. And those people that are devoted to Socionics, for instance, will sort of, oppose anything that they think isn't deep enough or doesn't cover, all these different things that they think are important. As I said before, I don't have any problem with someone system and thinking that's important. The only time I have a problem with it is when they sort of use it to bash anyone who doesn't fit the way that they look at things. And Keirsey seems to be a common scapegoat for when they come up with or they see people using stereotypes, type-based stereotypes. They blame David Keirsey for that, whereas I look at it as, he presented some examples of things that fit his system. He wasn't saying, everybody fits exactly this, archetype. And so I think if someone uses that, then they're really the ones sort of using the stereotype, and they're just using Keirsey as a scapegoat. So yeah, generally I've heard there's people that say, oh, it's outdated because he uses examples that, don't apply as much now because society moves on and we don't use the same terms. And one of the things that I've read criticism of is when he talked about the guardians or SJ types. Some of the stereotypes, that were used to sort of give examples are outdated naturally, because guardians are sort of like the stalwarts of society in terms of the ones that are sort of the gatekeepers of how society is. And over time, obviously that shifts somewhat. They're not all going to, maintain exactly the same values and all that. And so those things can, if you read some of the stuff that he wrote in, in a book that was written in the 70s, obviously not all the specific real life examples are going to still apply, as much as they did then. And so you have some people that criticize it on that level. Then, but generally it's mostly the people that say, oh, well, you have to get deep into these function things. And Keirsey didn't do that. In fact, he specifically said he didn't really have use for Jungian functions. And the funny thing is somebody can follow Keirsey's system, as Ben, has talked about. Ben, does all kinds of stuff with Jungian functions and still gives plenty of credit to Keirsey. So it's not really one of those either or things, like you have to choose a side and which side are you on or something. And so I don't even like it when people present it that way. But yeah, it tends to be, people say, oh, he stereotyped too much, or he was too limited. His way of grouping is like too basic and not in depth enough, and doesn't take into account the functions, things like that. So that's probably the common criticism I've heard. And to me, again, I go back to what's the purpose of typology in the first place? And the answer to that can be different things. And if your purpose is to, simply do a lot of theoretical models, then the function systems and all that makes sense, because you can use that for whatever you want to. But if your actual goal is understanding people better, improving relationships, things that in real life interactions with people, then it seems to me then the goal should be what connects with the most people, what makes sense to the most people, what can people understand and actually benefit from. And that's why, to me, I think the Keirsey system shines through, because it's something that's easier to explain to people, easier to observe, and you don't have to start from a point of, oh, well, read this 300-page book and understand what all these shorthand symbols and things mean, and then we can go from there. You have a much easier, starting point and relatable point, and so you can kind of, what I've observed is you can see these common issues coming up, and you can have a quicker sort of solution to them, or at least ideas to them, as opposed to having to spend hours going over theoretical models, which, again, like I said, I don't have a problem with people doing those things if that's what they enjoy doing. But I feel like that, the only reason I have any value in typology is human relationships and improving things with people, and, getting attention for myself in any way I can, because that's, that's the most fun thing. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing is it's not, I always try to make it, not make it seem like, it's some sort of like battle to the death between these psychology systems or something, because I don't have, that to me doesn't do any good for anything. If people want to do that, great, but that's not my goal.
Right.
Okay.
Something else I can say as an example there, when Jeff talked about how SJ has changed. So, for instance, my mother's an ISTJ, and she's a keen recycler because it's expected. So it's like, whereas in the past, if someone was a recycler, would say, "Oh, that sounds a bit more NF-y." It's they changed with the times, and and people get. I think people should realize about Keirsey temperament theory is it's not behavioralist. It's really about motivation. And that's why Linda Behrens, who was a student of Keirsey, she changed the name from temperament to essential motivator pattern, where all these temperaments are about motivations. And so an example of that is one of them. And Linda has sort of like worked with Dario Nardi for over 20 years. So Dario Nardi is a big believer in temperament as well. So, and he's like seen it in the brain, like these patterns amongst SJs and patterns amongst SPs. So there's some backing up of temperament. And there's also with certain hormones, I think it's serotonin for the SJs, dopamine for the SPs. There's some underpinnings there for the temperament. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, that's actually really a great point you brought it, because I think it's I really like the aspect of it too in a lot of ways. I always had questions about it, because I always read it and I'm like, okay, there's particular things I'm curious about. The categories, just to give you guys an overview of what it is, you have the guardians, the rationals, the artisans, and the diplomats. Is that correct? What is the other category called?
Idealist. Yeah.
Idealist. Okay, so and if you pair that with Myers-Briggs, the idealists are NFs, the rationals are NTs, the guardians are SJs, and then the artisans are SPs. So the ESTP is the one that I always was curious why they called it artisan. Could you explain that further, Jeff?
The SPs in general, or ESTPs specifically?
The STPs.
So are you saying how do they fit with the rest of the artisans?
Yeah, I've always seen them as highly artisan is associated often with people who are artistic in a sense. So could you kind of draw a parallel?
So like how are ESTPs artistic? Is that what you?
Yes.
Well, he covers that in Please Understand Me Too, that the way he defines art is very broad. He's basically, one of my favorite things actually, he said what sort of defines SPs is that the thing that we want is the next action is a free variable as opposed to a fixed constant. So the idea is what binds SPs more than anything else is freedom, and freedom to act in the moment, and the next thing that happens being something we can decide and choose, as opposed to being something that is planned and scheduled and all that. So the thing that all four SP types have in common is that desire for free action, and the way that we do it may be different depending on type and of course circumstance. But ESTPs, they want, to give an example of a very prominent ESTP in the news lately, our newly elected president, Donald Trump, his whole thing was the art of the deal. and that's was used by Keirsey actually as an example of an ESTP thing, that ESTPs are often their artistry is often in promotion, sales, sometimes sports, things where they have an opportunity to, sort of and have control over, what sort of their environment, whatever they can do to shape the environment or to lead other people sometimes in the direction they want them to go. My son is an ESTP, and there was one time, the last time he played soccer, he was 8 years old, and I'm trying to come up with a name for their soccer team. And basically there was sort of like a few other suggestions being thrown out, but there was sort of like a few timid expressions. Maybe somebody raised their hand and said something. And my son just started yelling the word explosions over and over again. And it was like in the course of 2 minutes, him just yelling explosions, everybody else in the team basically just decided, yeah, okay, we'll be the explosions. And that's what they named the team. So it was a case where it was just his forceful persuasion something, because he just, insisted on sort of plowing ahead and saying this name. So, but obviously there's tons of different ways that can be expressed, but the idea is that there's sort of an art in wheeling and dealing and persuasion and, sort of the kind of sales technique that ESTPs kind of do in their life. Not necessarily the profession of sales, although it can be that, but anything where they're sort of selling themselves or an idea or whatever the thing is that they're trying to change in their environment.
And there's other part, you got artistry, audacity, adaptability, and I remember EJR&D talking about, there was a funny bit in it. He did a chat with Renamix, I think it was an INFJ, and he said, I'm an artist, and she says, what kind of artist? A martial artist. And he really did see martial arts as an art like that. He actually said that.
Yeah, I mean, and the art of movement and all that stuff, Bruce Lee talked about that quite a bit.
Can I interject real quick?
Yeah.
As an NF, the more I learn, not just about typology, but as I've grown up, one of my biggest frameworks to how I see what I do and what I want to do for the world, I see communication as an art form, and communicating and wanting to understand people more as an art form for me, to be able to communicate in a way that's just, very creative, and it comes from a place of wanting to create something different through each communication. And so me being an NF, right, I really value the art of communication, right, what kind of guided me towards this area to begin with. I was looking for more. I was looking for more understanding to create with.
Yeah.
I'm always looking how to translate my thoughts into something just totally different.
Well, what Ben said earlier too was, it's essential motivations. You got to think of why you're wanting to do this art form, and it really boils down to, if we're talking Keirsey, it's because you want to improve relations with people in an idealistic way, and that's what like Ben said, essential motivations. Jeff, would you say that's aligned?
Yeah, and I thought of another example while he was saying that, with my son, because he told me about times where he was with friends or family where they were sort of having a conversation that he wasn't really involved in, but he sort of knew what buttons to push, or knew what things would sort of inspire them to have a conversation or a conflict. And so he would sort of throw out an idea about a particular, hot button issue, whatever it was, that he didn't really care about, but he would sort of pretend that he did just to get the conversation started, and then sort of sit back and watch as, the conversation happened. So his motivation for doing that would be different than Daniel's, for instance, probably, but he might do the same action in terms of the idea was, art of communication in terms of something he could say that would sort of facilitate conversation. So.
Yeah, when I heard what you were when you were talking about that, it actually reminded me quite a bit of, with SC and NI. Why wouldn't ESTP, for example, want to see something in art form? But what if all that engagement is to attempt a converged meaning or a higher meaning, right? In the sense of like that introverted intuition, taking all that SE and trying to bring um, some kind of feel or theme or something. You know what I mean? Like all that SC has to mean something in a sense, and so that would make a lot of sense when it comes to like sports or whatever it is that they're doing that they're trying to bring meaning out of. It's an art to them. All of what they're doing is it's almost like they themselves and their engagement is like a big piece of the art. And it doesn't necessarily matter what it is that they're doing. They might enjoy some parts of it more than others, but that's just what I was thinking of when it comes to the functions.
I'm going to give Blake
Jeff,
a chance.
you've mentioned. Okay, I was just saying that Jeff one time mentioned that artisans like to put their spin on everything, on whatever they do, like an individual spin, and also the emphasis on freedom.
Comes out of, I think, Brains and Careers and also Personology, where he basically said that he was kind of contrasting SPs and NTs because, some people basically would say, what's the difference as far as coming up with new ideas? And, basically he said that with SPs, it's less that we generate completely original ideas as is we take other people's ideas and sort of spin them to put our own stamp on it, because again, the motivation is different. It's more about, like Ben mentioned, the 3 A's, the artistry, audacity, and adaptability, and sort of presenting that image, showing our skills. Those things are more important than being perceived as completely original in the idea. So, when it comes to something like music making, for instance, because obviously a lot of artisans are, a lot of people in the music industry are SP types, and they'll try to like come up with new sounds or new ways of presenting music, but it's not like it's 100% out of nothing. It's always sort of like you start with something and you mess with it. You find a new way of that when you think about stuff like whoever was the first thought of music, scratching a record, when you had a record playing and you would, start messing with the record physically and making other sounds with it, things like that, where is a good example because it's something that's already there, and you just find a way to physically alter it and make a different sound. And that's kind of sort of a basic concept of doing that. It's in terms of putting your own spin on things. So you can apply it to lots of different stuff. I mean, in terms of even the words used and like slang words and coming up with new ways of saying the same thing, and new names for things and stuff like that. My brother and I used to, as kids, fun just pronouncing words wrong on purpose. Like just, we would say a word a different way just to sort of see how it sounded. And we would, intentionally say, mispronounce things. Whereas with the guardians and the idealists, who would usually be like correcting us, like, no, this is the right way to say it. And then we were like, well, we know what the right way is. We're just changing it because it's fun to do that. It's fun to put your own, opposed to always having to be the correct way.
So I want to move over to Blake real quick. He represents the Guardian temperament in the Keirsey system. So, obviously he's going to use a different word choice and a different thing. I want to get a little bit of his thoughts on this. I don't know if Blake's read up on Keirsey a lot, but I'm sure he can offer his perspective as far as being of Guardian temperament and kind of analysis of that. So, Jeff, you want to just give a brief overview of kind of what the Guardian temperament looks like to get Blake caught up to speed if he hasn't heard of Keirsey. That way Blake can share his experiences relevant to that. Would you mind doing that, Jeff?
No, not at all. I think that's another thing I think that that Brains and Careers did a good job of, was really pointing out the importance of SJs, because I think there's sort of been maybe in the typology world a bad rap, for Guardians at some point, because a lot of the people that we're talking about and studying and using typology were intuitive types, And a lot of them sort of saw, either they had parents or authority figures that were SJs, and they sort of, talked about being oppressed by these people or held back, or, and viewed them as being like, simple or limited and just all this kind of negative stereotypes. And what he focused on was saying, look, society is held together by SJ types. All of these things that people take for granted in their daily life as working correctly and providing the foundation and the infrastructure of all of these things in society. SJs are a lot of the people who maintain these things and make sure that everything works properly. So basically he said that they have logistical brains, are focused on making sure people, places, things are where they're supposed to be, when they're supposed to be, so that things function properly. Making sure that things are stored and disasters are prepared for. Serving in leadership positions, social networking, making sure people, that all the kids have a cupcake on their birthday, and all of those kind of things. A lot of teachers and administrators, and so there's a whole lot of things that are sort of like foundational things that people take for granted in society that are held together by guardian type people, because the logistical aspects are what they specialize in. So, and again, like every other type, profession wise, and what they do with their life, they can go into any field or whatever, but there are certain things they're going to be naturally better at. And it's usually going to be those, using that logistical intelligence and whatever it is that they go into. So there's a real brief thing.
All right, Blake, go ahead. Share your experience preferring SJ temperament.
Well, I can say that I think the reason why the NP types, especially, that grew up with a overbearing ESTJ father figure or other authority figure that was ESTJ, they were a little bit confused about the value system that the ESTJ had, because that's what happens whenever you have a very underdeveloped FI. Well, I just feel like if you don't let people know what your values are, like your motive behind why you're being so pushy, why you are making sure things are done in a certain way, that they can get confused and just think that you're a power-hungry egomaniac. Our job is to enforce. I'm looking at this chart right now. It says it's our role variant is enforcing, and that I take that very seriously. I think it's important that we have people that make sure policy is pushed and rules are followed, but I also like to break rules if I feel like they're not effective or they don't represent the greater good, or they don't align with my values. There we go.
So I've known a few ESTJs pretty well in my life, and I would say one thing that they all have in common is that they're very driven and have a very, to me, admirable work ethic. And there's somebody that tireless when it comes to what they think is important, that they're going to see it through the end because they feel like it's their duty to do that, and that they don't want to let down whoever it is that they're trying to do things for. So yeah, it's one of the things I've learned from all of this stuff is a better understanding of just everybody's motivations in terms of it's whatever it is that I think is important element, and the other type is just as important to them. And so to SJs in general and ESTJs specifically, Keirsey called ESTJs the supervisor type. And the thing is they feel like if somebody doesn't take charge and make sure these things are done, then they won't be. In a lot of cases, they're right. It's not just they're trying to be bossy or control other people. They're looking at what's the most effective way to get these things done. And even as children, you can see, in situations where you've got a group of kids, that often there'll be, one or two kids that will take charge more than the others in terms of making sure that, that they organize things. It's not always just a parent or an adult and the kids are all just wandering around aimlessly, because you'll have that, you find those ESTJ kids that will take charge even in a situation where it's all children. So it's fascinating sometimes to see those dynamics play out and think about, you know, just how every type is important, and regardless of, you know, people have had bad experiences with people of any type. ESTJs probably get a bad rap because they have that take charge mentality that tends to be kind of in your face sometimes with people. You know, so because that is a sort of a forceful thing, more people can be affected by it and kind of have that same experience. Whereas by contrast, most people aren't going to say, well, you know, my life was controlled by this overbearing INFP. You don't hear that very much because INFPs are not in their natural roles, are not as likely to, you know, to take charge of situations that way. But it doesn't mean that one of those types is any more important or less important than the other. It just means they have different roles they play.
Yes, there's something we didn't mention was that Keirsey, you broke down the temperaments by interaction style. So for instance, we were talking there about ESTJ, they're like the in-charge type. Linda Bounds would call them in-charge. David Keirsey called them initiator. And then you've got like the contenders. So that would be like INTJs, ISTJs, ISTPs, and INFJs. So that they, Linda Bounds called those chart the course. So they're like directive, sort of like directed in an introverted way. And then you have like the sort of like the collaborative style of interaction. So that, again, this is something you can see. You can see how people interact. So those people, Linda Bounds called those, yes, get things going. So for instance, ESFJs try to get things going. ESFPs try to get things going. ENFPs and ENTPs. Then there's another kind that's more reserved. For one from each temperament is reserved, the most reserved. Where you've got like INTP from the NTs, INFP from the NFs, ISFP from the SPs, and ISFJ from the SJs. So you can look at someone's temperament and interaction style to that. So yeah, I mean, if people want to know about Keirsey in a slightly more updated way, they can sort of like check out Linda Bounds. Oh yes, and just something about about the types in Jeff's family. His father, INTJ, his mother, INFJ, older brother, INTP, younger brother, ISTP.
Yeah, so as Ben was talking, I picked up my Brains and Careers book, and what he was talking about is actually on the back. They have this that shows initiator, contender, coworker, responder. So basically, it's like one of those in each temperament. So yeah, it kind of goes to what he was saying about the interaction styles or whatever, though he didn't call it that. But anyway, yeah. For example, my type, known as the performer artisan or ESFP, could also be categorized as a tactical coworker. And without getting into a whole long thing about what that means, what he meant by co-working was basically something where there's sort of a direct relationship, feedback relationship with other people or one person, you know, whatever it is. And so for SPs, the ESFP is the type that in our natural habitat, you might say, most depends on working with other people, in that as in the role of performer, we depend on an audience to give us feedback. If we don't have that, then we can't completely fulfill our role. So in my daily life, my favorite thing is I mean, on a basic level, it's making people smile and laugh like that. I like that better than anything else that I can do. And so that's the direct relationship I have as a co-worker with somebody else is, you know, I say something funny, they laugh. That's the very basic, you know, way of describing it, but that's basically what that is. It's a co-working relationship because we depend on each other for that to happen.
Yeah, so if you guys are just introduced to Keirsey, what you're going to see is these different, think of it like kind of like an Excel spreadsheet, rows and columns. And essentially, you're going to have one of those 4 categories this way, and then one of the 4 categories this way, and then you're going to have a special title for whatever you are. Essentially, it's very much like Myers-Briggs in the way that it's arranged. There are 16 different temperament types in Keirsey system as well. So you can pair them with that. A complete and fulfilling complete cross-reference where they can completely, merge together. That is where there might be an issue. Like I said, they're different systems. Ultimately, I think Jeff and I, and Ben included, all look at all personality systems and try to get what we can out of it and move forward, because I think our goals are relatively similar, is to maximize our own development and our relationships with people and kind of get a good understanding of who and what we are without actually being so biased on one system being better than another. I don't really have the patience nor tolerance to argue systems, which one's better, which one's worse. I just try to take the best of what I know and the best of what I can and look at it in a very big picture sort of way and go, this is how you can get an ultimate understanding of all these different systems and kind of better understand yourself, so your interactions with people are ultimately improved. That would be my analysis of least of the situation involved. And Ben, I think you're about to say something. Would you mind shutting off your video so we get smooth audio from you?
Yeah, I'll just have something to say about there's a dichotomy that's specific to Keirsey called compliance versus adaptive. So, for instance, in the Keirsey will list the NFs and the SJs as compliant, and the SPs and the NTs as adaptive. It's a little bit nuanced for the NFs. So maybe, Jeff, if you want to tell us how you think NFs are compliant or cooperative, because it could...
Sure. Yeah, because everybody tends to understand, how SJs would fit in that category. With NFs, it's a little bit different, but ultimately, whatever value system that an NF has, they want for people to be in harmony with each other, basically, to get along and be on, be moving towards something, that whatever it is they kind of view as the ideal or how, society or how people should be, to cooperate to go towards that goal. So I think cooperator actually is probably a better word than compliant, but in general, like, NFs, for instance, don't tend to as much as SPs. They're not as likely to want to break rules for the sake of breaking them. If they break a rule, it's because there's a purpose behind it towards whatever that goal is of people, being in a better situation or better harmony or better, whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish. So in general, they kind of, to oversimplify it, want people to get along, kind of have that can't we all just get along attitude. And so they don't like it when people sort of stir things up just to cause problems or to, see what happens. It's more like, if we're going to upset the apple cart, then there needs to be a good reason for doing so that moves us towards something that's going to help people. It's generally what they view it as. Whereas SPs and NTs, like NTs are still trying to, usually have a goal when they upset things too, but it doesn't necessarily have to be like they're perfectly willing to have a bunch of conflict and upset in order to reach whatever that is, because they view it as there's a bigger picture and something more important than that, and people's individual feelings getting hurt or whatever is not as important as whatever that other issue is. Whereas SPs will break rules and stir things up, simply for the fun of it. And that doesn't mean that we go out of our way to hurt people's feelings or to cause conflicts, but it just means that it's sort of secondary, like whatever the thing, we look at what works, what's effective, what gives us the reaction we're trying to get or the result we're trying to get. And that's more important than any particular like big picture kind of view.
All right, so guys, we got to wrap up this call in the next 5 minutes. I'm going to open the floor to any questions we have in our chat room and or the audience here, as well as Ben or Daniel. And then I will keep an eye out for any questions popping in the chat room. Obviously, we're not going to cover all the temperaments and the aspect of each one, but I do want you guys to be able to ask questions that we can answer in the next 5 to 10 minutes. So that being said, the floor is open for questions. And if our participants want to participate as well. So,
but I have one that Jeff could talk about, and it would give an example of this informing versus directive. Like if Jeff could tell us about the difference between, say, the SFPs and the STPs? Because I think
Sure. Keirsey called STPs operators and SFPs entertainers, and so this distinction, you know, SFPs, it's like our goal usually is to, you know, entertain people in some way, to create something or to do something that gets a positive reaction that you know, that is entertaining in some way. It doesn't necessarily mean, you know, you have to be like a singer or a dancer or some, you know, specific like entertainer profession. It just means just in life, you know, that's what I get the most thrill out of, the most positive feelings out of, is entertaining people, you know, in whatever way I can do that. And like I said before, it can be as simple as just, you know, saying something that somebody thinks is funny or interesting in some way that entertains them. You know? As far as the operator side of it, they are less concerned with, you know, entertaining people and more with, you know, in the action of it itself. And I don't have like, I don't have the exact quote in front of me to, you know, say what he said exactly about operators. I know more about myself, obviously, but what I've observed about STPs is that they'll often not be quite as considerate of people, because they're not really thinking in those terms of, you know, making other people happy. But it doesn't mean that they can't do that. It's just, and so I'm trying, you know, I'm probably sounding like I'm making the STPs out to be more selfish, and I don't think that's true. But it's just from my perspective, there's less consideration of people there. But it doesn't mean that, you know, they're any less important in what they do. Just, you know, I probably didn't do a very good job of that, Ben. I'm sorry.
Jeff, you gave an example when we talked before about how I think you said that the SFP will like talk to someone because they want to get to know them and like learn things, whereas like I think the STP is they want to learn something and then in the process, yeah.
Yeah, actually, that, you know, that was something I discovered when I had my chat with DJ R&D a while back. Is that I thought was really cool. Probably the best thing that came out of that conversation was because he was talking about, like, you know, talking to strangers, and, you know, if he was like on a bus or in public somewhere, and he would just, and, you know, he said he would ask people questions to get information, and in the course of doing that, he would get to know people as individuals. And I said it was, you know, for me, I do exactly the opposite. Is I ask questions to get to know people, and then I gain information from that. So it's like two different approaches, you know, doing the same action, but sort of approaching it differently and coming sometimes to the same point from two different directions. So I thought that was a cool way of looking at it. Another thing that occurred to me was, you know, that I sort of basically said the STPs didn't tend to be more focused on objects, you know, machines or things that aren't people, and SFPs are more people oriented. And that is, you know, it's kind of an oversimplification, but on a basic level, they do tend to sort of focus more that way. And it doesn't mean they don't do plenty of the other, but it's like, you know, it's more about the tool and the machine and the you know, the physical aspects of things, as opposed to, you know, sort of the human relationship side of things, which I think SFPs are a little bit more oriented towards that.
We have a few questions from the audience I want to make sure we address. Jason asked, what was the way that the pairings were created, and what is the reason behind why they are paired the way they are rather than what the pairings are? So Jeff, I think that one's directed toward you.
You mean like the difference between like Myers putting them as like STSF versus SPSJ?
I think so. And then just the what was the way, how did he get to categorize them? And Jason, just to summarize the answer to that portion of the question, is basically they demonstrated most of the common characteristics and they grouped them in bigger groups. Instead of 16 different groups, you have bigger groups and categories that demonstrate the same underlying motivation. But I'll let Jeff cover that in more detail here in a second.
Yeah, well, you know, basically, it was just came from his observation. I mean, David West Keirsey was a psychologist and a counselor with children. He worked with schools and observed a lot of children and you know, their parents and the way they interacted and all that. And through observation, he just looked at, when he was looking at what characteristics each type had in common with each other, he simply saw when he looked at this historical 4 temperament thing, that those groups seem to fit better, that the SJs and SPs, he observed those groups sort of having more in common with each other, whereas he saw more differences across the other ones. So for instance, he saw more difference between STJs and STPs than he did between, you know, STJs and SFJs, just as one example. So it was just sort of a observation of, you know, these have these linking characteristics more with each other. They have more in common. It doesn't mean that you can't divide them in other ways and find some things in common. You know, I said to Keirsey's son, you know, David M. Keirsey on his forum, I said, you can I sort of looked at it as like, you know, NTs is logically abstract, STs logically concrete, you know, NFs abstractly, or whatever, I forgot what I said exactly about that. But anyway, it was sort of like, you can use these other groupings, but there's just not as much in common in terms of, you know, across those divisions. And so that was sort of the major break between Keirsey and like some of the young theists, as I call them, because, you know, they'll say, well, these two types have, you know, whatever the function is, you know, introverted thinking in common, so therefore they're more like each other. But what he was saying is if you observe them in real life, you find that even if they may share that, it doesn't come across as similarly. Like it's the way that they express it is different enough that in terms of observation of their behavior, you're going to find more in common with SJs. And I agree with that. My observation, when it comes to, if you looked at it on paper and you said, you know, okay, STJs would theoretically, if they used feeling, that they would prefer introverted feeling according to the function model. But what I've observed in real life is that STJs are usually just as strong in terms of kind of having an attitude of everyone is supposed to follow these same roles as SFJs do. So it comes across in terms of the way it's expressed, much in the way that extroverted feeling is described in models, in terms of they care more about the group and everyone sort of fitting into a certain mindset. So I think that, you know, Keirsey was right in that as a practice in real life, those groups make more sense together.
I totally get what you're saying. Whenever I find out somebody's MBTI type and they tell me what their major is or what career they want to pursue, and that career is like the total opposite of what that type would excel in, I'm like, bro, dude, why are you doing this? Have you heard about the 16 personality tests, or have you heard about MBTI? Of course, I don't say that anymore, but you know.
All right, guys. So I think we had a few more questions I want to make sure we get to. So there's a lot of dialogue going on, a lot of questions that we aren't going to answer, and there are a few. There's a lot of questions that are unrelated to this. Let me see. There was a few more, but actually, I think that's as far as the Keirsey's temperament goes. I don't see any questions related to that. So that being said, let's wrap up this call. And Ben, it sounded like you had one more thing to add, so I'll let that go, and then we will wrap up this call.
I can say so. I did a small video on my channel, 3 minutes, about the cognitive basis of the Keirsey temperaments, about functionally why they are justified.
All right, so guys, if you caught that, Ben said go on his channel if you want more about the Keirsey temperament and how they're justified functionally. So he has a video about that. Ben, what's the topic of that video?
I think it's just called like I can give you the link for it later. It's something like the cognitive basis of the Keirsey temperament, something like that.
Okay. So
yeah,
guys,
we'll put the link in the description. Ben, just send that over to us, and we'll have it in the description in a few.
Yeah.
And I would say that if anyone wants to know more about my perspective on all this stuff or whatever, that, you know, like I said earlier, my channel is the SP Spaz, so you can contact me and I'd be happy to elaborate on anything else anybody had questions about. So.
Perfect.
Yeah, Jeff's done some really good videos. Like what I think one of his better ones is like ESFP preference versus reality, where he talks about how everything that the ESFP wants he matched, but his own individual circumstances meant that he was sometimes quite different from the profile in terms of like the behavior of the type.
Yeah,
but the preferences were there.
I went through like practically everything in the actual, the original Please Understand Me book for the description of the ESFP, and kind of it probably helped with what we were talking about back in the beginning of this about in terms of, you know, sort of an overview of stereotypes versus what actually plays out in real life. So a lot of people, when they read a type description, you know, they'll either like click with it right away and say, oh yeah, this definitely describes me, or they say, well, you know, I'm not like this, I don't like that, and so then they think, well, I must not be that type because that didn't respond to this description. And so what I get into in that video is a little bit more of the nuances of how when I was 20 years old, I would have easily said, no, I don't fit this, but now as I look at my life and I really look at the differences between what the motivations are versus necessarily the specific actions mentioned in the description, how much it really does fit. To me, I look at things and it doesn't make any sense for me to consider any other type but ESFP, because it just makes so much sense to me now. But originally it didn't, and I sort of get into why that is and how you can sort of figure those things out even if you don't necessarily immediately relate to a type profile.
All right, guys. So that's it. You know, we thank you, Jeff, for coming on and spending an hour with us and sharing a little bit of your knowledge about the Keirsey temperament. And Ben, always a pleasure, and as well as our co-host and Daniel with the shades. You know, so that being said, guys, there's going to be a live show on Talking with Famous People. Make sure you get on that. It's going to be some really good stuff. It starts here in about, I would say, 53 minutes. Of course, it's Talking with Famous People, which means it's probably already started, but it officially starts in about 53 minutes from now. So, guys, if you want to get on that, it's going to be about depression, anxiety. Make sure you get on that as well. And thank you guys for participating. Ben, Blake, Daniel, Jeff, Trey, thanks so much. And we'll see you all guys soon, okay?
All right, bye-bye.
Take care.